Hi, people joining. I'm just going to give it a minute or two so that people who are coming can enter the webinar. Let's just see. Okay, quite a few people have joined. So I'm going to make a start. Okay, welcome to today's event, everybody. It's going to be an introduction to the urban greening factor, or the UGF, as we'll be referring to it. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So I'm just going to give you an outline of what we'll be talking about today. The presentations are going to last about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll be following with a Q&A session. So we should be finished around about 1:30. So the webinar is going to give you an introduction into the urban greening policy that we've introduced in the London Plan. And we'll be talking specifically about the urban greening factor guidance that we've published, and it's out for consultation at the moment. So we're going to cover what the UGF is and how it's applied to developments in London. And we'll look at how it relates to some of the other policies in the London Plan and how it can be used to deliver local greening priorities. And we're going to give you all the information that you need to give us some feedback on the consultation. And we're going to end with a Q&A session. So feel free to ask any questions that you have using the Q&A function as we're going along, and we'll pick those up at the end. Next slide, please. So my name's Rian Williams. I'm part of the London Plan team at the GLA. I'm going to be passing over to my colleague, Davenport, that you should be able to see on your screens, who'll be introducing herself in a moment. And we also have some other colleagues here who will be supporting our session today and answering your questions as part of the panel. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded and we're going to make this video available after the event. Next slide, please. I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to the planning system in London for anyone who's not familiar with it. I'm sure some of you are, but just to give a quick whistle-stop tour. So at the national level, the NPPF sets out the policy framework for England. And in London, a mayor is responsible for producing the London Plan, and then each borough within London produces a local plan. At the smaller scale, there are optional neighbourhood plans. So the London Plan and local plan, and where relevant, any neighbourhood plans, they come together to form the statutory development plan, and they contain the policies that development proposals are assessed against. So all planning applications must be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So a number of different things can be material considerations, and that includes the NPPF and the National Planning Policy Guidance. But it also includes London Plan Guidance, like the UGF guidance we'll be talking about today, and boroughs' supplementary planning documents. So decisions on planning applications in London are generally made by the boroughs, but some schemes, and that's mainly larger scale schemes, are referred to the mayor, who can decide to call in the decision. And just for context, around 350 to 400 applications are referred to the mayor each year. The mayor will call in to determine around 5 to 10 applications per year. Next slide, please. So the current London Plan was published in March 2021 following examination in public, and it sets out a strategic vision for how London should grow over the next 20 years or so. And it also sets out how boroughs' local plans and new development should respond to this vision. So all boroughs' local plans must be in general conformity with the London Plan to help achieve these citywide objectives. The London Plan contains over 100 policies, covering a range of different planning issues. I think most relevant to what we're talking about today it plays a really important role in tackling the climate and ecological emergencies facing us. Next slide, please. So now the London Plan's adopted, we're looking at how we make sure these policies are implemented. So we're working on guidance to support a number of specific policy areas, including the Urban Greening Factor Guidance. If you're interested in seeing any of the other guidance that we've published a couple over the last few weeks, and we're also consulting on another piece of guidance. We're going to give you some links at the end of the presentation, and we'll also circulate those links to you. So this London Plan guidance doesn't go through the same process of examination in public as the London Plan does, and that's because it's based on policy that's already been through that process. But it is subject to consultation, which the Mayor will take into account before finalising the guidance. And as I mentioned a second ago, the guidance is a material consideration in making planning decisions. And next slide, please. Great, thanks. So the draft UGF guidance was published for information earlier in the year. There wasn't time to conduct a full consultation before the mayoral elections earlier in the year, but we wanted to make sure that people could get to grips with the guidance as soon as possible. The consultation we're doing now it's not about the urban greening policy itself. So the policy and the associated scoring and targets were discussed as part of the London Plan examination in March 2019, and the inspector's report supported our broad approach. So what we're asking for now really is views on the detailed guidance to make sure that we're delivering the policy in the most effective way possible. So that's it from me. I'm going to pass back to Sam, who's going to take us through the UGF in a bit more detail and talk about how it works in practice.
Sam is just having some, you've been able to unmute.
I have just been able to unmute. Sorry about that, everyone. I was having some technical problems with screen share on Zoom, sort of best laid plans and practice that still didn't work properly. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Rhiannon. My name's Sam Davenport. I work in the environment team at the GLA on green infrastructure policy. And our team works closely with Rhiannon and her colleagues in the London Plan team to develop planning policy around environmental issues. So I'm going to focus now on what the urban greening factor is, sort of how it works, why we've introduced it, and the kinds of outcomes that you can achieve through a policy like the urban greening factor. So the policy sits within a wider green infrastructure chapter in the London Plan, the Chapter 8 Green Infrastructure, and it's part of a complementary suite of policies that together protect London's most valuable green infrastructure features, but also require that new development proposals enhance London's green infrastructure network. So the UGF is part of policy G5, urban greening. So the policy requires that new major developments include urban greening as a fundamental element of site and building design. So this means that greening shouldn't be looked at as something that's applied at the end of the design process, but design decisions should seek to maximise the amount of greening that's included and make sure the greening that's included is appropriate and will work within the context of the new development. The policy goes on to say that boroughs need to develop an urban greening factor to identify the appropriate amount of urban greening required in new developments. And as an interim, the Mayor has set target urban greening factor scores that boroughs can use, and that's a score of 0.4 for predominantly residential uses, a target score of 0.3 for predominantly commercial uses. So the policy does exclude uses B2 and B8 from the requirement to sort of meet these targets, but does say that schemes that fall into these uses should show how they've maximised urban greening, and so should still provide a UGF calculation. So the UGF itself isn't actually sort of the purpose of the policy. It's the tool that allows an evaluation of whether enough greening is being provided to make greening this fundamental element of site and building design. So the factor itself, the UGF, is quite a simple calculation that's carried out based on the kinds of green cover that you find in developments, or the kinds of surface cover rather. And how it works is it assigns a factor score to all the different types of surface covers that you typically find in a development. And these scores are listed in a table in the London Plan under policy G5. The scores are sort of all relative to each other, and they're based on the ability of that surface cover type to firstly absorb and then to hold rainwater, and that's as a proxy for the naturalness of the surface. So for example, the picture at the top of the slide there, top right hand corner, is a natural wetland that's been provided in a new development, and that would score a factor score of 1 in the UGF. And the green roof in the bottom of the slide there would score a factor score of 0.7 in the UGF. So it's an extensive green roof, and the score in there is based on the substrate depth of the green roof. And as you can see, these factors go through from semi-natural habitats, trees, green roofs, down to features like permeable paving, which score 0.1, and then sealed surfaces, which all score a factor score of 0 in the calculation. And the UGF is calculated by measuring the area of all these surface cover types, assigning them the factor score, and then carrying out a simple calculation that takes into account the overall area of the development site to come up with a UGF score. And we've provided a calculator that people can use to do this calculation, and you can link through to that in the UGF guidance. So sort of an example of what that then looks like in terms of a development plan. This is a kind of typical landscape plan that you get in a development, and it shows where there's sort of trees or new grassland being provided, different types of surfaces. And this is it translated into a UGF plan. So in this case, the landscape architects have taken that first plan and categorised all those different kinds of cover types in the development according to the UGF table in the London Plan, and have carried out the calculation. So in the guidance, we provide very detailed information on how to categorise different types of surface cover, and also how to measure them and carry out the calculation. But actually, at its heart, the UGF itself is a tool to help discussions around whether the appropriate amounts of urban greening and good enough quality urban greening are being proposed in new developments. And it's a tool that allows conversations between applicants and the local planning authorities of boroughs, or when a scheme's referred to City Hall as a referable application to the mayor, sort of allow those discussions to take place about whether the right amount of greening is being provided. The UGF isn't a very, it's not an academic model. It's designed to be simple so that it's easy to use. And also importantly, the UGF doesn't provide the answer of the exact type of greening that's suitable for the development. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the coming slides. So that's what the UGF is and how it works. When does it apply? Well, it applies to all major developments across London, as set out in the policy that I ran through a couple of slides ago. I think a really important point about the UGF to understand is that it should be applied in combination with those other policies in the London Plan, and in particular the policies in Chapter 8, the Green Infrastructure chapter. Because the UGF is a policy that's requiring development to provide an overall gain or an overall benefit towards London's green infrastructure network. So it needs to be applied in conjunction with policies that protect the most important parts of the network. So an example for this could be a development that scores a very high UGF score, but might be having off-site impacts on a site of importance for nature conservation. And in that case, the proposal would satisfy policy G5 around the UGF score, but it wouldn't satisfy policy G6 in the London Plan, which protects sites of importance for nature conservation. Another really important thing to remember about the UGF is that it's not promoting new green infrastructure for the sake of greening a development. It's not about, or wholly about, sort of aesthetics and how the site looks. It's very much geared towards delivering multiple benefits through new green infrastructure. So the UGF can and should be delivering against other policy requirements and objectives, such as increasing the canopy cover of London, improving surface water management through new SUDs, and achieving biodiversity net gain and improving access to nature. The UGF is designed to be really flexible. So as I mentioned, it's quite a simple calculation, and you can see from sort of that table that I referenced earlier in the London Plan where the factor scores are assigned. They're quite simple classifications, and it's designed to be really flexible so that the greening that's provided on a site can be appropriate to the local context, the local landscape context, can respond to local priorities that urban greening can help to meet, and works within the context of the development type. So how that site will be used once the development's finished. And here you can see some examples from our SUDs sector guidance. The top shows how SUDs could be incorporated into a commercial development, and the bottom picture illustrates sort of a different approach you might take, integrating SUDs into, I think in this case it's more of a community use, so sort of different approaches for different uses. But the flexibility also makes sure that sort of at the detailed design level, landscape architects and ecologists can choose the right plants for the right place. So plants that are going to cope in sort of the perhaps intensive use that the development might sort of face when it's developed, or can deal with shading or extreme sort of microclimates, or provide the right kind of plants that will benefit local wildlife. So this flexibility is really important. But whilst the UGF is flexible, it's inherently designed to promote quality over quantity. So the better quality urban greening that delivers more benefits, it gets a higher score in the table, and this incentivizes these features to be provided. And there's just an example here, the image on the left and the image on the right. The image on the left would score more highly in the UGF. It provides semi-natural habitats and grassland cover versus the image in the right. In the guidance, we make very clear that project design briefs, where applicable, and sort of the scoping of projects should really look to maximise sort of and look for synergies between urban greening and other policy requirements. And I'm going to talk through a few examples now of images sort of to illustrate what this means. And here we have an example of a new SUD scheme that's been put in, and this was near a primary school where there was poor access to green space. So it's providing some really important water management here, surface water management, but it's also providing informal play space near the school. So it's looking for those sort of clever design that maximises the benefits. In this example here, this is a new area of public realm that's been provided. So it creates a pocket park area where people can come to sit. It's also incorporating rain gardens, so it's managing surface water. But all the planting's been designed to provide for pollinators, and in the background there's a bike storage area, and that has a green roof on, and that's all been designed for pollinators as well. So in this relatively small space, it's been designed really well to maximise the benefits that it's providing. Sort of jumping up a sort of scale to a much larger development here, where this area has been provided. It's a new wetland feature, and it creates new priority habitats that have been listed out as priorities in the London Environment Strategy. It's been designed to provide habitats for rare species in the area. It forms a really important part of the public open space strategy for the site. but it's also a key part of the flood risk management for the site. So it sort of holds water. So again, this is an example of urban greening being used to meet multiple objectives. Urban greening can also be used that can contribute to the UGF score to help segregate walking and cycling routes and promote active travel in new developments. In this example, this green roof has been designed really carefully down to the choice of substrates to create sort of open, very flower-rich habitats for pollinators that have been identified in the local biodiversity action plan. It's also been designed so that the roof can accommodate solar PV panels. Whereas this roof's quite a different design, but it's also been designed for biodiversity, but it's a different kind of design. It's more of a woodland garden because it's part of the public open space in the scheme. So it's been provided that people can use it, versus the other one, which was provided for biodiversity and for the solar panels. So that's sort of some examples of how urban greening can be designed and integrated into developments to meet a range of objectives and to deliver a lot of different benefits. The guidance, the UGF guidance, is clear that that different local priorities should be reflected in the greening for a site, and sets out some places where applicants can find out more information about what might be relevant, and this includes borough green infrastructure strategies or other development plan documents or associated plans such as tree strategies, biodiversity action plans or open space strategies. We've also published a number of data sets and tools that can help to make decisions about priorities, excuse me, including our green infrastructure focus map. And this brings together a range of environmental and social data sets and highlights where there is more or less need for green infrastructure interventions and the kind of green infrastructure interventions that would be most relevant in a location. We also have published a design for biodiversity gain through urban greening document to help bring together decisions about how urban greening can be included in new developments to deliver biodiversity net gains. Very simply, it takes the factor table that was set out in the earlier slides from the London Plan, so the urban greening cover types and the factor score, and looks at the biodiversity potential of those different cover types and some of the design considerations that need to be addressed to maximise the biodiversity potential. And the guide also includes a number of diagrams about how different types of features like green roofs and sustainable urban drainage can be designed to maximise opportunities for biodiversity. And we published this in conjunction with London Wildlife Trust, and you can download it from this link here, and we will circulate links after the session for all the things that were mentioned in the presentation, so that you can have a look at them. So that brings us to the end of sort of the run through of what the UGF is and how it works. The consultation on the London Plan Guidance is live now. We did publish the guidance earlier this year in March, because we knew that people were keen to have more information about the UGF as a new policy and how it's worked, but we weren't able to launch the formal consultation on the document until now. So the consultation is live on that document and closes on the 20th of December. Again, there's a link to the web page for accessing the consultation. Would encourage you all to go and sort of take part and fill in the consultation, please. There's also a link below to where you can sign up to find out about other London Plan Guidance consultations that are either live or will be when they're put live in the future, so that you can get involved in those as well. But as I said, we'll email around everybody with the links from here so that you can access them easily. I'm going to come out of the presentation now, and we're going to open up sort of a Q&A session with Rianne and also colleague Sam, who's online, to answer any questions you might have about the UGF or any points in the presentation. So please do start putting questions into the chat if you've got any.
Thanks for that, Sam. I can see the only question we've had so far is about showing the slides after the event, and we'll make sure a PDF of the slides is included as part of the links and things that we're circulating. That's the only question I can see so far. So I'm going to kick off with a question that we've. Oh, is there another one?
Yeah, as I said, we've got a question actually. There's a chat and a Q&A.
Oh, sorry.
It's the way that the Zoom event's set up. But a question, Rianne, probably one for you about policy G5. What is the definition of major, and how does this align with the various reasons of referral under the Mayor of London order, i.e. all referable planning applications subject to the UGF?
Yeah, so actually the definition of major is quite a bit below the referral criteria. So the sort of really big stuff generally is referred to the Mayor. That's over 150 units, or there's other criteria based on height or whether it's on greenbelt or mole. But this policy actually applies to things below that. So the definition of major is anything with 10 residential units or over 1,000 square meters of floor space. So it's going to capture quite a lot of development that happens in London. So it will obviously apply to a lot of applications that we don't see at the GLA, and that's part of the reason we've put this guidance together, is to help boroughs implement the policy. Anything to add to that, either Sam? Okay, I can't see any other questions, so I'm just gonna, got a couple of questions that we've been asked in the past. So one of these is what happens if a borough doesn't have a UGF target in their local plan? Sam D?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. So yeah, this is a question we get asked quite a lot, because obviously it's a relatively new policy in the London plan, and boroughs are still going through sort of the process of updating their local plan. So in the interim, the targets in the London plan apply to all developments. So until a borough sets their own target that in their local plan, that's what should be used.
Okay, there's another question that I'm going to pose to you, which is, does introducing something like the UGF mean that actually we end up losing existing green spaces?
Shall I start? And I think, yeah, Marianne, if you want to. Yeah, so as I was sort of covering in the slides, the UGF works, it's really important, it works in conjunction with the other policies in the London plan. So the plan provides really strong protection to greenbelt and metropolitan open land, also to sites of importance for nature conservation, and these cover around 20% of London's surface area in sort of the core ecological network of the city. The plan also provides protection to sort of veteran trees, ancient woodlands and trees of high value. So whilst sort of the greening that's provided through meeting the UGF can contribute to how these are protected from a development, the proposal still needs to show how it's meeting those policies in their own right. So the most important sort of public open space, for example, is protected through the plan, that's picked up through other policies.
Great, thank you. So I've got another question that's come in here. So as certain types of greening have a higher factor, how can authorities ensure they have a good spread of different types of greening? So for example, ensure not all greening is grassland with no trees. I don't know who wants to have a go at that first. Maybe Sam G?
Yeah, I'm happy to think about that one. Yeah, I mean, the one of the key things around the UGF is that there's many different ways of meeting the score. So it does encourage kind of a diversity of greening. I've looked at many UGF calculations supporting developments, and from doing that, I haven't seen kind of a one-size-fits-all approach at all. Something that Sam Davenport mentioned in the presentation is that the UGF is very much orientated towards quality rather than quantity. So accepting it was just a quick example in the question there, actually seeing a lot of grass and with no trees would be very unlikely to really hit the scores needed. really we would need to see much higher quality features being proposed in order to meet the UGF in what are often quite constrained sites within the city. Also, I think it's, again, touching on something that Sam mentioned in the presentation, really important that applicants seek to design greening that is responsive to the local green infrastructure network, and increasingly as boroughs start to prepare things like nature recovery networks and green infrastructure strategies, they need to be reviewing what's in there to make sure that what is proposed is not just a paint by numbers, but does actually fit into servicing the wider network and delivering the range of functions needed for an individual site. So applicants should be doing that, and I think officers should be ensuring that that is brought through in planning conversations.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Sam. Had no more through the Q&A. I'm just going to pose another question, which is, what happens if a development doesn't meet the target? What happens then? So maybe another one for Sam G.
Yeah, I mean, so again, just from experience I started reviewing applications for the UGF prior to its, around the time that it was going through the examination in public, where it was a very early policy, and we saw a good uptake initially, but increasingly schemes have been able to meet. And again, I'm pointing back to something that Sam said in her presentation, that actually the key thrust of the policy is that urban greening is embedded as a fundamental element of site and building design. And I think when that does happen, and there's early conversations between architects and landscape architects and civils about how much space and do we need to provide for greening, it very often can be achieved. However, admittedly, there are some sites and some scenarios where it is just not feasible. And sometimes that's due to architecture and design. Sometimes it's particular character constraints. Sometimes it's civil engineering constraints. I must say, from my experience, they're few and far between, but it does happen. And I think then it's down to whoever is the determining authority to really make that judgment call to see if the applicant has truly explored all of the viable options for greening and sought to provide the maximum quality and quantity of greening. And I think we've got to be realistic that there will be some sites that just can't hit it. There are some boroughs may look at some kind of offsetting mechanism, but that's not something that we've done within the local plan. It's really just having that, this UGF facilitates that conversation with an applicant to make sure we've done the absolute maximum we can. And I think there are admittedly occasions when that will not be feasible, but that the emphasis is on an applicant to demonstrate that, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's also worth saying, isn't it, Sam, that obviously you were reviewing, as you mentioned, like schemes before the policy was and the plan was formally adopted. And in those instances, just using the UGF as a tool and then having your sort of expert eye looking over them, we were often able to go back in our comments and say, well, we think that greening could be increased through these kind of approaches. And I would say most times there was always scope, and it was all often taken, or most of the time taken on board. So whilst that isn't the purpose and the intent of the policy to try and retrofit greening into sort of existing plans, I think it does show that for most kinds of development, for most developments that come forwards, the UGF scores they're challenging, but they're achievable, and you should be expecting to see most schemes meeting the score. Which perhaps leads on to, there's a question I noticed about how the scores were determined. Yeah, shall I?
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is sort of connected. We've sort of partly covered some of this, but if you want to continue. Yeah,
so how did we set the score? good question. Hello, David. Sorry, I know I can't see you, but you can see me. It's a bit strange on these formats. But yeah, we looked at how the UGF had been used elsewhere, or similar things to the UGF have been used elsewhere. So there are parts of North America and other European countries where they've used similar kinds of often called green space factors, and usually on a smaller scale to London. So that was one of the challenges, setting sort of a target that would work across all the different sort of landscapes and types of development that boroughs deal with. So those targets were set looking at what was seen to be achievable sort of in general across London, but the policy in the plan does recommend that boroughs set their own targets. And I think where a borough has a sort of a specific either concern or an evidence base to show that more greening is needed, they can alter the targets and then have that reviewed through their own local plan process. I think actually when you look at what is delivered though through thinking about those targets, it is quite high levels of greening compared to what's sort of seen as the day-to-day business as usual levels of greening provided in developments, and we are seeing schemes that deliver more than those. It's not uncommon to see schemes exceeding those targets. I think sort of residential schemes hitting 0.45 and even 0.5 that's not uncommon. So some applicants, and I think where developers want to show that sort of they have good sustainability credentials, or they're really taking a landscape-led approach to a new development, will exceed the scores.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I've got another question in here on trees. So when considering planning application, often trees that aren't TPO and are doing category C or U are presented by planners as okay to be lost. Yet research shows mature and established trees do more in terms of UGF scoring. How can local plans protect trees considered in current plans as low value? Maybe trees one for Sanji?
Yeah, I mean, I can see, yeah, from my experience, the background to that question, often we get tree surveys in with category C trees. I think in terms of how can the UGF help, the trees are, existing trees are included within the calculation, and that's based on their current canopy spread or that establishment. And also if the stem of the tree is on the site, but the canopy happens to go beyond the site boundary, then that canopy is included. So there's a bit of a presumption in favour of those trees on the boundary to be very much making a larger contribution to the overall UGF. But otherwise, I think probably the UGF isn't necessarily hasn't got much more to offer in terms of the protection of trees, whereas that is really through, again, it's that Sam's point around the wider suite of policies that the UGF sits in, and the presumption for retaining trees is both within chapter 8 of the London plan, but then would be probably through borough local plans. So it's not saying, I mean, well, I'm agreeing that there is the issue, we see it quite regularly, but really it's through independent, tree policy separate from UGF. Often we would ask applicants to provide a CALAT assessment to start to put some numbers to that. But I think that's kind of comes second to just a presumption of retaining trees on site, to be honest.
Yeah, great, thank you. I've just seen there's a couple of questions that popped up in the chat that I've missed. So another one is, if LPAs are or will be setting their own targets, will a strategic approach also be undertaken that interconnects with SSSIs and sinks that extend across borough boundaries? This would hopefully help to provide higher levels of protection and enhancement for key ecological corridors and areas. Sam D, can I field that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, got some feedback there, so that's fine. So I think this is another example sort of where the UGF isn't this fix-all or catch-all in terms of what we're trying to achieve through planning policy for the natural environment. So it does interface with these issues. So already sinks can be identified across borough boundaries. It isn't that common that it happens because they tend to be identified at borough level, and the same with SSSIs actually for decisions about sort of site ownership and site management. They tend to get cut to boundaries of that reflect site ownership. But a lot of the metropolitan sinks in London, especially those that are along river corridors, are across multiple boroughs. The Thames is the obvious example of that, but it's true for a lot of other tributaries of the Thames as well. So there will be a requirement that's coming forward in the Environment Bill for a local nature recovery strategy to be prepared that covers the whole of England, and there'll be about 50 of these, and we anticipate, it hasn't been confirmed, but we anticipate there'll be a London sort of one that fits with the GLA boundary for London, and that will map out sort of strategic opportunities for nature that UGF proposals can respond to. And next year we're also going to be publishing guidance on how boroughs can prepare green infrastructure strategies, and that will take into account how they approach planning for nature and sort of planning for nature recovery in a spatial way as well. So I think as the evidence base around some of this starts to develop, I think, yes, those spatial cross-borough ecological networks will be a really important part of the information that developers should be looking at and boroughs should be thinking about when they're reviewing applications for sort of how urban greening's responded to those kind of issues.
I might just follow up. I mean, I absolutely would agree with what you've said, Sam, and there's different mechanisms to do that, but there is also the option when setting borough targets to have a slightly different target for a different area of a borough, so distribute that spatially. And therefore, it may be that if there's an area identified as a particular deficiency in green infrastructure and urban greening, that might be scope to increase the target in one area. Or likewise, if a borough felt that actually we could use the UGF to protect and buffer existing ecological assets, that may be something that could be considered. So elevating scores for that buffer or particular increase in certain areas. So that would be another option where the UGF might be able to help, secondary to your point, Sam.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sam, and actually also picks up on, I think, one of the questions earlier about like scoring and is sort of where appropriate levels of greening and how do boroughs make sure they don't end up with lots of one type of greening, and that flexibility in the policy to set those kind of local either targets or directions for certain type of greening is how that can be dealt with.
Thank you both. Another question we've got here, does the guidance include further information on potential tensions between greening SUDS benefits and biodiversity benefits? In particular, intensive green roofs are often defined as parks and are accessible to the public, which could potentially undermine biodiversity benefits.
Probably one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I should have said at the moment, I saw at the beginning it's sort of green infrastructure policy broadly, but also specialise in sort of biodiversity stuff here. So we do cover that in not SUDS specifically in the guidance, but there is a section in the London Plan Guidance for the UGF that talks about how urban greening can deliver biodiversity net gains, and where sort of different situations where different approaches might be necessary. So we talk about, for example, if a development's adjacent to a site of importance for nature conservation, then it would be appropriate for all the greening there to be really led sort of with an ecological approach that looks to be complementary to the sink and expand the sink's habitat and provide benefits for the kind of species that you're finding on the sink. So we include that in the guidance, and we also provide a link through to the London Wildlife Trust GLA document that I mentioned that we prepared with the LWT to try and really bring these 2 points together, urban greening and biodiversity net gain. I think coming to the point specifically about green roofs, so I think historically we as a sector, sort of the ecology sector, have always thought about extensive green roofs of being biodiverse roofs, because you're right that typically the more intensive ones have been more intensive, less sort of ecologically valuable garden spaces, but they can be designed to provide biodiversity benefits where providing access to them is important as well. So there was a picture I included in the slides that was a roof that LWT had worked on, where they'd gone sort of taken an approach of more of a woodland edge kind of design to the site, and they'd incorporated wetland features onto it so that the roof held water above the roof surface rather than draining straight into the substrates to provide for biodiversity. So the design guide actually touches on how you can develop, deliver for biodiversity even where biodiversity outcomes might not be the primary driver for the greening that's being provided. So I don't think there's necessarily a tension there. I just think it's understanding at the beginning of the project what the sort of the main considerations are, but you can always sort of work options for wildlife into that.
Great, thank you. It doesn't look like we've got any more questions there. or anything in the chat. So I think I'm going to draw things to a close. So just to say thank you to presenters and panelists today, and thank you to everyone who came along to listen and ask us questions. Just to confirm again, we'll be sending around the links to the consultation. So I'd really encourage you to all have a look at the guidance, and please let us know what you think using the survey. Great, thanks a lot. Speak to you soon. Bye.